Okay, so hello and welcome back, and today we're going to be doing kind of a short video on the regional Southern Pacific services in Texas. So let's just get right into the outline. This was going to be a video topic I wanted to do back when I was doing stuff more towards California about the SP's regional services in California that aren't really as well recorded. But since I'm kind of in another SP neck of the woods, I'm going to just talk about the equivalent services in Texas briefly. As mentioned in one of the previous videos about the Southern Pacific, it arrived in Texas in 1881 when it bought the Texas and New Orleans Railroad in the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio. As mentioned, the SP didn't stop with their mainline Sunset route between El Paso and New Orleans, and by 1903, the Southern Pacific had an extensive network within Texas. Not as extensive and monopolistic as it would be in California, but still a very substantial network. And today I'll be talking about the Southern Pacific services that ran at its height, and I will mention this up front. I have no idea when any of these services were canceled. I know they were running in the 30s and 40s, and I'm fairly certain that by the mid-50s all of these trains were gone. And again, I understand that, this is not the SP directly because the SP was running as a subsidiary due to Texas state law. Again, a thing mentioned in every Texas video that, technically not the mainline railroad. It's a subsidiary in Texas because their state law says that you had to, and yada yada yada. So anyways, today we're going to be talking about the named trains, the unnamed trains, motor cars, and mixed trains. And also, for fair warning, the Sunbeam and its route is talked about in a separate video. That would have been chronologically the last one. So anyways, we're going to get into the named and unnamed trains. These are trains, not we'll get into that. So the main train on the schedule, and by the mid-1930s, would have been the Border Limited. This train is an interesting train, to say the least. Despite there not being any, or really that much recorded history about it, the train either ran multiple frequencies or split a few times. But there was service that went from Brownsville, Texas, on the border with Mexico, and ran north to Corpus Christi, and from there it split, and a section went into San Antonio, and eventually connected to St. Louis over the Katy and Frisco, and the other section went to Houston, with connections in Houston to other parts of the SP system. In the 1930s, this was a standard secondary train on the Southern Pacific. It carried heavyweight coaches, chair cars, section sleepers, and given its long distance, probably some type of dining service. It's not mentioned in the schedule whether or not it did, but given its distance, it was very likely. There was also a plethora of once or twice a day short haul trains that ran around Texas. Of note, there were connections between New Orleans and Denver. This started off as 4 separate trains that would consolidate down to 2 at Fort Worth, through to Denver. And my guess as to why this happened is that secondary trains tended to run slower schedules than the first-class trains. Another train to Texas was the Alamo, which ran from San Antonio to New Orleans, through Houston, rather. This train also carried some through cars from Denver to New Orleans, and this is one of those trains that was a secondary train but didn't make a transcontinental run. That would be the Argonaut during the 30s and 40s, and eventually, I think, into the 60s, whenever it was canceled. On other parts of the network, there were 2 round trips daily between Houston and Shreveport. Don't know how to say that, don't care. And 2 trains per day between Houston and Austin via Hempstead. And one of the Shreveport trains carried a 3 sleeper along with it, and the other was a coach-only train. One of the Austin trains also did carry a 3 sleeper along with it. I will also note that the Southern Pacific was one of the railroads that made a difference between coach and chair cars. Coach cars are the older heavyweight cars that had padded bench-style seats, and chair cars were essentially what Amtrak would consider a coach today. Some of the railroads before Amtrak didn't make a difference between coach and chair cars, and some railroads did, and some... It's one of those things where every railroad uses a different and oftentimes inconsistent naming conventions for them, unless the railroads worked together or it was a Pullman service. And speaking of a term railroads didn't use consistently is the term motor. On its schedules, trains 301 and 302 ran from Houston to San Antonio via Victoria, so it took a slightly more coastal route between the 2 cities. And when it comes to these old schedules and calling something motor, it could have meant something either like a bus or a self-propelled passenger car like a DMU or a Bud RDC. And this is an example of the latter of the two. Digging further into the schedule shows that this is some sort of rail vehicle. The SP would usually mention when a connection was a bus and not call it a motor, whereas other railways would call it a motor. It's one of the, again, confusion for the sake of confusion. They were an owner of Pacific Greyhound, which was one of the companies that would become Greyhound, Greyhound proper, what we know today, all being consolidated into Felix today. Other regional services included in the SP at this point was Waco to Yoakum, a train from Paris to Ennis, and a various number of mixed trains. And let's just kick this over to mixed trains. A mixed train was basically a freight train pulling a coach and mail combine car at the end of the train on some branch line. And this was generally done in the SP throughout Texas and Louisiana. And this is just going to be one of those cases where I just kind of have to throw up a map to look at all of them. So all these like little lines here, like out to this place called Salt Mine, all these little branches up here in Louisiana, some of these branches throughout Texas. There was actually a couple coming out of Austin that I didn't show on the map. This Paris to Ennis train also is a mixed train. This one here through whatever this town is north of Houston, from Beaumont up to Dallas, also a mixed train. There was a lot of these throughout Texas on the SP. Anyways, this is going to be the point where I start talking about the decline, failure, and eventual cancellation of these routes that no one really seemed to care about, and I have no idea when they all ended. Given that the Sunbeam was their top tier train and it was gone in 1957, I really doubt that the other Texas trains, aside from the Sunset Limited, lasted much longer than this. This is also one of those times where I'm going to talk a little bit about how a network needs to be useful before people start using it. Out of all the things you could say about regional services in most of the U.S. is that they were never really ran frequently enough to attract riders in any large way. I know, again, some parts of these other country were still really rural, but the busy corridor between Houston and Dallas was served by 5 round trips a day at its peak on 2 separate railroads, not including the Santa Fe and the Katy Railroad. Again, not entirely sure what their services were. Haven't fully looked into them yet, and also not entirely sure how useful the Dallas to Houston service on the Santa Fe was. But if we're talking like daytime mostly coach trains, where there's at least 5 round trips between the two cities, and again, they didn't really work. And again, one of the things a transportation network really needs is to have denser corridors between bigger cities, that run relatively frequently, which again is expensive, which is why they didn't really do this. And just having 2 round trips per day does not really make a very useful form of transportation. I mean, it's a lot better than a daily or a tri-weekly train, don't get me wrong, but again, twice a day on such short routes is not particularly useful in the grand scheme of things. And since this is the governing logic of most railroads, even including Amtrak, there's a reason why, routes fail or they don't do as well as they could be doing. And as much as it would be nice to have some of these routes back, they need to be running a lot more frequently than twice a day, especially between, again, Dallas and Fort Worth. Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth. Honestly, the train route should honestly be starting at 8 trains a day, not the 3 or 4 that Amtrak wants, because, again, Amtrak is dumb and really conservative, kind of like the, the rail, like the SP would have been, and even the Burlington and Rock Island. Which is, again, and then we'll be getting more into this when I start wrapping up the urbanism series about how, how railroads and having better services actually helps your economy instead of just being a random cost that the government bears, which will be, again, in those videos. And thank you for watching, and I hope you do come back for the next one. And, thank you for the, support, the commenting, subscribing. There's a Discord now. Link is down below. And we'll see you in the next one.